Ukraine's forces have achieved the unthinkable. They've crossed the Russian border, launching a surprise invasion that left Moscow reeling. The question now echoing in the Kremlin and around the world is, how did this happen? How could Russia, with all its might, have failed in its most fundamental task, preventing an invasion on its own soil? As of this script's writing, Russia's so-called special military operation to reclaim Ukrainian land has turned into a nightmare. 900 days in, and it's Ukraine that's rewriting the rules of this conflict. Even if by the time you watch this video Ukraine has been pushed back across its border, the war has changed forever. But to understand Russia's catastrophic failure, we need to explore a critical factor that has ironically aided its collapse more than any Ukrainian offensive ever could: NATO's restraint. Throughout this conflict, the West and Putin have been locked in a tense game of cat and mouse. The West has cautiously escalated its involvement, delivering increasingly capable weapons to Ukraine. Each time, Putin responded with his usual threat to unleash nuclear devastation, and each time, the West hesitated. The debates over sending modern tanks raged for over a year until Britain finally said, "Hold my tea," and broke the deadlock by sending a few Challenger tanks to Ukraine. Yet despite these breakthroughs, the top-tier equipment came with strings attached. In a bid to avoid provoking Putin's wrath, Western powers imposed heavy restrictions. Weapons couldn't be provided to Russian rebel forces. Ukraine was initially forbidden from launching strikes into Crimea, and any cross-border attacks by Ukrainian forces were strictly off-limits. This was a severe handicap for Ukraine, as Russia exploited its ability to launch attacks from behind the safety of its border, where it was shielded from Ukrainian retaliation. To grasp the absurdity of this situation, picture a boxing match. Ukraine is up against an opponent with a much longer reach, Russia, but Ukraine is forbidden from getting close enough to land a punch, while Russia is free to jab at will. It's not hard to see how this fight could end. Then this past summer, the stakes rose dramatically. Russia began massing troops and equipment just across the border from Kharkiv, preparing for a massive offensive. Ukrainian intelligence had warned of a looming assault, but the exact location remained a mystery until the shelling began. With 50,000 troops poised to strike, Ukraine found itself in a desperate situation. But in a surprising turn, President Biden authorized Ukraine to use American long-range munitions to disrupt the Russian advance. For the first time in the war, Ukraine was allowed to strike Russian forces on their own soil. HIMARS rockets, both GMLRS and ATACMS, rained down on Russian troop concentrations, vehicles, and equipment, crippling the Kharkiv offensive. In one strike, Ukraine unleashed over 120 precision rockets, shattering Russian forces on their side of the border. President Biden had given authorization for American weapons to be used in a limited fashion inside of Russian territory, responding to Russian attacks or within a certain distance from the border. This still placed the vast majority of Russian high-value targets, such as airfields, out of reach, but it ensured that Russia could not mass forces on its side of the border without being harassed ever again. But nobody could have guessed how the paradigm would radically shift once again just 2 months later. Even after suffering a defeat in the Kharkiv offensive and taking significant casualties in cross-border missile and rocket attacks, Russia still believed that the old paradigm was still in play. NATO would never dare authorize Ukrainian military action into Russia itself, aside from the use of long-range munitions. After all, Putin had spent 2 years at this point rolling out the old nuclear saber and rattling it, making sure the West would self-deter as much as possible. This brings us to the situation on the Kursk border with Ukraine right before the UAF invasion. To say that Russia has fought this war in extreme luxury would be an understatement. Despite Putin's propaganda that NATO poses an existential threat to Russia, it's not stopped him from stripping troops and equipment from all of his shared borders with NATO countries. Even the Kaliningrad exclave has seen massive drawdowns for service in Ukraine. This is because despite the rhetoric, Putin knows that NATO does not and never did want a military confrontation with Russia. Thus, he's free to leave nothing more than a token force on his borders with NATO. This same understanding stretched to Ukraine. While Russian targets in Ukraine were finally free game for the UAF, Putin's fundamental understanding of the rules of this conflict was that Ukraine would never dare invade Russian territory, and especially not with NATO equipment. Sure, small cross-border raids by separatist groups were an ongoing concern, but these raids were easily rebuffed after only a few days and inflicted barely any political or military cost on the Kremlin. Thus, Russia has historically only secured its border with Ukraine with forces large enough to deter small-scale raids and respond to an eventual skirmish, but not large enough to stop a conventional force looking to seize and hold Russian territory. FSB border security troops and conscripts make up the bulk of Russian border forces and are spread thin as is, far thinner than would be the case in a normal war between two neighboring nations. If this were a normal war, Russia would maintain large garrisons all across its border with Ukraine, along with picket forces meant to detect an invasion attempt that the nearest garrison force would then immediately respond to. Ukraine lacks the manpower to require a full-scale defense of the border, but even this economic strategy would still require tens of thousands of soldiers given the several hundred miles of border between the two nations that's still controlled by Ukraine. However, because Ukraine's hands are tied by its Western partners, Russia doesn't have to secure its border, even with this greatly reduced force level. It's instead free to send those tens of thousands of soldiers and all of their supporting equipment into the front lines inside Ukraine itself, leaving its border secured with far less well-equipped and trained paramilitary forces and conscripts. This has helped put considerable strain on the Ukrainian defenders, who still have to maintain their own border security forces out of fear Russia could quickly assemble an invasion force on its side of the border with little to no notice. And unlike their Russian counterparts, these border forces need to have armored vehicles and air defense systems, or else Ukraine could suffer a catastrophic flanking attack that could threaten to collapse the front. It's easy to see where this is going. Early in August, Ukraine exploited this complacency to stunning success. The second point of failure in Russia's defense of its border came from ignoring reports by its border troops. FSB border troops and their conscript augmentees began reporting unusual Ukrainian activity in late July, growing in concern as they believed that possibly a major raid was going to take place. We likely won't know the real answer until well after this war is concluded and the archives unsealed, but it's likely that Russia ignored these reports out of, again, its sense of complacency. If Ukraine was massing troops on the border, then it was just a ploy to get them to redeploy forces from the front in the east, where Russia was and continues to make incremental gains. However, this being Russia and the full scope of its incompetency now known to outside observers, it's also just as likely that these reports never made it up the chain of command. And if they did, then they weren't shared with the rest of the Russian defense apparatus. Russia lacks a unified chain of command between the FSB, its National Guard, and the regular military, and there's no telling where a point of failure could have occurred, but the opportunities are plentiful. What's clear is that Russia's deep complacency extended even to carrying out surveillance of its wartime border. The Ukrainian invasion went off without a hitch, kept in absolute secrecy until the very last minute, a testament to Ukraine's ability to maintain strong operational security. However, there's simply no excuse for Russia to not have been conducting aggressive surveillance of its border at all times. Russian patrols equipped with surveillance drones should have been sufficient to detect the buildup of forces and raise the alarm. The third point of failure is Russia's unprepared physical defenses. Ukraine took a lot of heat in the Kharkiv direction when it was discovered that despite the threat of Russian invasion, local commanders had not strongly fortified against a Russian assault. Yet the difference between the Ukrainian defenses north of Kharkiv and Russia's border defenses is significant. Best reporting states that the Russians had set up as much as 2 lines of trenches, but these were very sparingly manned. There were defensive fortifications where Ukrainians met stiff resistance, but upon making contact, the Ukrainian invasion force simply drove past them. Cut off from the rear, defenders were forced to flee, surrender, or put up a doomed last stand. This is best exemplified by the performance of Chechen fighters on the border. There were elements of the Chechen 141st Special Motorized Regiment, also known as Kadyrivets for their loyalty to Chechnya's head Ramzan Kadyrov. Another moniker they go by is Akhmat Special Forces, and they have a fierce reputation, feared even by Russian troops as some of the best, most aggressive fighters in the entire Russian armed forces. At least up until February 24th of 2022. When faced with real combat, these TikTok warriors were soon discovered to break and run more often than not. They repeated this performance in the Kursk Oblast, where dozens of Chechens were captured with Ukraine showing off their documentation as proof, while the commander of local Akhmat forces fled to the safety of the rear. In a TikTok video, he claimed that the reason Akhmat had failed to defend the border is that Ukrainians simply drove past them. Captured Chechen travel documents would say otherwise. The failures to coordinate a defense are not just due to physical deficiencies though, but also critical failures in planning, strategy, and command and control. First, Russia failed to create a realistic defensive plan in case of incursion. Faced with the prospect of defending such a long border with limited troops, Russia would have been better served by creating pickets along the border. Every dozen miles or so and several miles behind the border, rapid response forces armed with drones, armored vehicles, and man-portable air defenses should have been stationed. Upon contact, picket forces would have been instructed to report the attack and break contact, trading very low military value territory for time. Rapid response forces would then be assembled from all neighboring encampments, assembled into a combined force, and sent to counterattack. The combined response force could then fight a delaying action if facing a significantly more powerful enemy, or deliver a counterattack to push invaders back across the border. In the meantime, response forces from encampments further away would have time to assemble, delivering augmentation forces to the front within 24 to 48 hours. This strategy would have served Russia's limited manpower pool very well, given that it would have been possible to fully man the border with multiple defensive lines all fully staffed. However, there's a plethora of reasons it was beyond the reach of Russia. The first is the fact that Russia's current border and regional forces do not share a joint chain of command. This is hardly new, as even inside Ukraine the regular Russian army struggles to perform joint operations between its branches, sometimes even between larger Russian units. Combined arms operations continue to be out of reach of Russia, and especially so in its poorly defended border. With a combination of conscripts and other forces, local commanders found themselves at odds with each other over how to react to the Ukrainian invasion, and the problem persists even a week after it began. Currently, Russia is planning its counterattack to contain the UAF, but this plan is being met with extreme skepticism. The most obvious problem comes from the composition of the forces assigned to Kursk. Currently, the Russian National Guard, Russian FSB Border Guard Service, Interior Ministry troops, conscripts from the regular army, PMCs, and other irregular forces have all been tapped for the response. All of these share completely independent command structures, and there exists no joint command structure between them. As usual, Russia is having to make it up as it goes along due to a lack of planning, and given their troubles with regular army forces in Ukraine, there's little reason to believe that a Russian response to Ukraine's invasion is going to be well coordinated or particularly effective. Particularly effective does not mean fruitless though. Russia still has a lot of manpower it's willing to send into the meat grinder. Compared to Ukrainian forces though, who by all accounts are made up of hardened combat veterans and experienced commanders, the Russian response is unlikely to be an efficient one. This time though, Russia may not be able to meat grinder its way to victory for one very specific reason. As the Ukrainians invaded Kursk, Russian units were either taken so by surprise, overwhelmed by the violence and speed of the assault, or destroyed in fighting. By and large, the UAF was going up against conscripts, whom by Russian law cannot be used as expeditionary forces outside of Russian borders. This hasn't stopped some numbers of conscripts from ending up in Ukraine, but even Putin has been extremely sensitive to the mass use of conscripts in combat. Shortly after the invasion, he personally met with mothers of conscripted soldiers who had accidentally been sent to Ukraine and has made efforts to prevent it from happening again. These conscripts are notoriously poorly trained and terribly equipped. Even in peacetime, they suffer from extreme levels of physical and sexual abuse, low morale, and very poor quality equipment and training. There's little indication that things have changed in wartime, and Russia's border conscripts have performed as expected, with the UAF taking hundreds of conscripts prisoner and inflicting a yet unverified, but seemingly high level of casualties on the rest. Russian troops dying en masse in meat grinder battles of attrition is nothing new. What is new, this time, is that photos and videos of dead conscripts are making the rounds on social media, but they aren't dying in distant battlefields, they're dying on the front lawns of Russian homes. One infamous example is a HIMARS ambush of a Russian reinforcement convoy, with the convoy destroyed directly in front of a row of Russian homes. Visual estimates of the casualties count around 3 dozen dead. Ukraine states that as of the writing of this script at the end of the first week of the invasion, it's taken 2,000 Russian prisoners of war. And there's little reason to doubt this figure is more or less correct, given the number of videos and photos shared via Telegram and other social media. In these videos, we can see Ukrainian forces detaining groups of up to 2 dozen at a time, with one video showing 30 individuals surrendering at once. Normally, it's prudent to be wary of media manipulation. This is a war after all, and social media is a powerful tool. But the depth of Ukrainian penetration into Russian territory and the wealth of evidence strongly hints that the Ukrainian figures are more correct than not. There's also mounting pressure from the Russian population itself concerning conscript deaths and capture. A movement meant to bring awareness to the killing and capture of conscripts quickly grew in popularity shortly after the start of the invasion, spearheaded by Russian mothers concerned for their own children conscripted into the military. Putin seems to be aware of the sensitivity of conscript deaths within the Russian population, an odd occurrence for a society with an extremely high threshold for pain in terms of regular war casualties. Ukraine may have been counting on this, with conscript deaths and captures feeding into its strategy. Many have wondered at the purpose of the invasion, with some criticizing it for taking troops away from a front where Ukraine is being steadily pushed back across many sections. Yet the death of Russian conscripted youth is already achieving an effect that scores of dead Russian contract soldiers isn't. The casualties are only likely to mount though, as reports are that only small amounts of forces are being pulled from the front as of the writing of this script. Instead, it seems like conscripts will play a role in the attempted retaking of Kursk, and the fact that the Kremlin seems to have no real plan does not bode well for these forces. It took 3 days for Putin to react to the Ukrainian invasion, a sure sign that nobody in this chain of command had a plan in place to deal with such an incursion. When Putin did respond, it was immediately clear that there still existed no plan for countering the invasion. The mixed nature of the planned response is indicative of how poorly prepared Russia was and continues to be. Please leave your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video.